The 12th of March 2026. And what I'm going to be getting into here is Michelle Eliade, or Eliade, however you pronounce that. The Forge and the Crucible. So what's the background to this? So let me see. So I'm going to be kind of in the light of my background studying Jung, and also some Indigenous Australian studies through Tyson Yungkaporta, and also the work of Jordan Hall, City to Civium. I'm kind of interested in sort of the implications of Jung's insights in light of the metacrisis in modern times. And so partly through coming through Vervaeke as well, like I understand that there is a certain, what I feel, relevance to the tradition of alchemy. And also, I feel that this tradition, particularly as expressed through Eliade, can also be quite revealing of what I would call, through Ian McGilchrist, hemispheric dynamics. So I've just named many of the different thinkers whose work is going to come up as relevant to this particular exploration. What I'm going to be doing is studying his book, The Forge and the Crucible, The Origins and Structures of Alchemy, originally published 1956. And I'm going to be studying it in the light of all those thinkers that I just named. I might also name in passing, probably the main people would be Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jamie Wheel, whose thought, other than, Jung, Heidegger, Tyson Yungkaporta, and Vervaeke are the main influences here. So let me try and proceed with that without more or less further ado. And I could be more specific, I guess, but for the time being, I won't. We'll just sort of see what comes up. I resonated with this text particularly. It was very provocative for associational thinking. I'll just sort of leave that as it is and give you the forward, and we go right into this without more or less further ado. So the forward, again, originally published in 1956, and I think originally published, in French, and it's been translated in 1978. Sorry, originally 1962 translated. And so I'm going to be mindful of his sort of context, writing with language that's sort of pertinent to the middle of the 20th century. We're now sort of 75 or more years after that point. Opening with the forward, Michelle Eliade. The first section of this small volume presents, through the eyes of an historian of religions, a group of myths, rites, and symbols, particular to the craft of the miner, smith, and metalworker. It goes without saying that I'm very much in the debt of the historians of science and technology. Their findings have proved invaluable. But my purpose in the present work has been totally different from theirs. Okay, just pausing already, we can see that it's a particular branch of alchemy that he's discussing. He's going to be talking about the group of myths, rites, and symbols associated with metallurgy, metalwork, the miner or the smith. This is a certain archetypal category. So what I'm getting at here is that it has to do with the origins of the metacrisis in terms of our relationship with technology. The idea that the history of alchemy and the archetype of the smith or miner can be revealing of our historical relationship with, or at least mythological relationship with, technology. So this part of my angle here, it goes on. My purpose in the present work has been totally different from theirs. My aim has been to attempt to gain an understanding of the behavior of quote unquote primitive societies in relation to matter being capitalized, and to follow the spiritual adventures in which they became involved when they found themselves aware of their power to change the mode of being of substances. Okay, so there's a kind of, in a sense, ethnographic or anthropological angle on, like, he's essentially he's wanting to gain an understanding of certain behaviors, and so in particular behaviors in relation to matter. So matter is here deified as the mother. And so that, like, Western culture has a particular obsession, in the sort of alchemy as the roots of the scientific tradition kind of thing. There's something about matter and focusing on matter that has been incredibly important to Western culture. So how is that focus different from the different focuses of, let's say, indigenous cultures, broadly speaking? And how is that difference reflected in the mythology? And how can our own Western biases deceive us and create, illusion or deception in our view of how the views of others may be different? And so specifically, he's talking about like as a certain historical discovery that it's possible to quote unquote change the mode of being of substances. And that this involves a discovery of a certain kind of power that results in quote unquote spiritual adventures. Let's see what else he has to say. He says, it would perhaps have been more worthwhile to study the demiurgic experiences of the primeval potter, since it was he who was the first to modify the state of matter. These experiences have, however, left little or no trace in the mythological record. I have, therefore, perforce been obliged to take as my starting point the relationship of quote-unquote primitive man to mineral substances, with special emphasis on the ritualist behavior of the smith and the iron worker. So there would be an obvious question that would follow upon that point, which is that why is it the case that the quote-unquote demiurgic experiences of the primeval potter left no trace in the mythological record? He doesn't address that question. He simply starts by taking, again, the mythology of the ritual behavior of smithing, metallurgy, mining as his starting point. Let's continue. Quote, the reader should not expect to find here a cultural history of metallurgy, analyzing the devious ways by which it spread throughout the world and describing the myths which accompanied it in the course of its propagation. Such a history, even if it were possible, would run into some thousands of pages, but it's extremely doubtful whether it could, in fact, be written. Okay, so already here we have a theme developing, which is that metallurgy is being studied as something which is, in a sense, demiurgic. There's a quality of there's a demonic quality to taking minerals out of the ground and modifying them, changing, altering matter in some way. He describes the quote unquote the devious ways by which metallurgy spread throughout the world. So again, there's this quality of how would you describe that? Like the language that's being used is itself provocative. It's indicative of the stance that Eliade is taking toward the origins of metallurgy and the effect that it then had on human culture. And we're going to go into this. It's kind of like the spirituality of the spiritual consequences of metalwork. Again, there are particular chapters in Tyson Yungkaporta's Sand Talk and Right Story, Wrong Story, or Wrong Story, Right Story, I forget which, that are relevant. We'll go on with Eliade, who, this is just the foreword, and like he states, the principal sources for the myths and rites connected with metals are Africa, Indonesia, and Siberia. And these are areas whose cultural history and mythology are either largely unknown or just beginning to become known. Furthermore, there are considerable gaps in our knowledge of the history of the general spread of metallurgical techniques. Wherever possible, the historico-cultural context of the various metallurgical complexes has been taken into account. Okay, just pausing. What does he mean by various metallurgical complexes? He's talking about a combination of literally like metalworking techniques that seemingly arose independently in different parts of the world, but that go along with particular quote-unquote historico-cultural contexts and different mythologies. So this is what he means by a metallurgical complex. It's kind of like it's a cultural complex in a kind of way. It's a set of practices associated with a set of beliefs, a set of behaviors, and a set of myths. Quote, but my main concern has been to pierce through to the mental world which lies behind them. So he's not primarily interested in the historico-cultural contexts, but he's mainly interested in the mentality that lies behind those practices, let's say. quote, mineral substances shared in the sacredness attaching to the Earth Mother. Mineral substances shared in the sacredness attaching to the Earth Mother. So there's a way that he's talking about sort of again, there's sort of in a way the origins of religion being mythologies associated with Mother Earth and the Earth Mother and the Mother, deified, and that minerals, different ores, different stones, and the techniques that were involved in their manipulation and changing them that derive from th that original, you could say, mythological style. It's more than a style, though, obviously. He says, very early on, we're confronted with the notion that ores grow in the belly of the earth after the manner of embryos. Metallurgy thus takes on the character of obstetrics. Miner and metalworker intervene in the unfolding of subterranean embryology. They accelerate the rhythm of the growth of ores. They collaborate in the work of nature, deified, and assist it to give birth more rapidly. Okay, there's already a lot here. So we have, first of all, the sort of mythological idea that rocks, that ores grow. They grow in the earth, like gold can grow if you leave it in the earth for long enough, which is, we would now understand, not true. But this is a mythological, I don't know, you could say theme, if you like, for a reason. And we're trying to explore what that could be. And so the connection is with the mythology of Mother Earth. So in the same way that the Mother Earth is like a womb in which something might grow, namely a child. So there's a connection here between, as you said, metallurgy and obstetrics, where the miner or metalworker is in some sense like a midwife. They're in some way intervening in this natural growth process in a way which is accelerating. And so this has to do with questions about human purpose and human origins. What is our role in nature? What is the proper place for our relationship with nature? How should we conduct that relationship? Well, the answer here is that it's about collaboration with nature, but that the mythology of metalwork and then leading toward alchemy is to accelerate the work of nature. And this is, we're going to see, profoundly risky. There's a way of that can be true, but there's also, like, what I'm saying is there is some truth to the idea that humanity and human behavior, human operations, the human way of being can collaborate with the work of nature if it can be properly recognized and accelerate it in a way that is, let's say, proper or appropriate. But there's also a way that it can be diseased and cancerous and problematic. And we're going to be exploring the difference again in some detail. They accelerate. Yeah, so the metalworker accelerates the rhythm of the growth of ores. They collaborate in the work of nature and assist it to give birth more rapidly. So the idea here underlying all that is that nature is actually trying to give birth to something or someone, and that this would be a beneficial process to facilitate, and that can in fact take place through alchemical work. Quote, in a word, man, with his various techniques, gradually takes the place of time, again deified, time. His labors replace the work of time. This is already super interesting. Like, can we see here that there's obviously, let's say, a naturally unfolding process that nature is in the middle of. And the idea is that it takes a very long time, and that we can allow that same process to occur, to transpire within our own time frame, within human timescales. That could be a beneficial thing in the sense of speeding up or accelerating in a beneficial way something that would otherwise take a very long time. Human timescales themselves being a natural phenomena. But then we can also see through the work of people like Henry Corbin, and I'm drawing from the series here on Tom Chetham, The World Turned Inside Out, which goes into some detail about Henry Corbin, Jung, and what he calls the imaginal world. The relevant piece here is from Heidegger. So this is Corbin stuff about how time, like historicity, the idea of being in linear time, past, present, future, that there was a past and that there is a future, that this itself is actually a myth. This is a mythological complex which we are embedded within that we do not notice. The idea being that the past in Heideggerian terms is phenomenologically present as not here, as no longer here. And the future, again, in Heideggerian terms, is phenomenologically present as not yet. And so in each of these ways, past and future, they're absences. They're absences. And this for Heidegger and Corbin, following, in a sense, at least phenomenologically, they identify that the scientism that relies on like scientism and also scientific reductionism, materialism, materialism, like physicalist reductive materialism, relies on this mythology of time that is ultimately nihilistic. And the reason that it's nihilistic is because past and future both boil down to being present as absences and lead us to nihilism. So the relevance of all of that is that if we, as humanity, can fulfill what I would call the true purpose of being here, in ways that we can certainly talk about, there's a way that through our technique, through the techniques that I would say are most deeply associated with human culture. I'm talking about an ecology of practices, running different kinds of psychotechnologies designed to catalyze collective awakening, something like that. I feel that that kind of cultural practice, which I feel is kind of at the foundation of human culture, that this can actually collaboratively accelerate the work of nature in an alchemical way that can, in fact, take the place of time. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about reclaiming our access to, vertically, like spiritually speaking, our access to the eternal. So in Indigenous Australia, this is the dreaming. I did a whole series on human origins that was about this, but the idea is that through technique, we can in fact access the eternal. And in a way, if that can be understood alchemically, we can in fact take the place of time. Time specifically, the effect of time in terms of aging, senescence, the weight of time. This is a Saturnian quality. This is associated with Kronos, and that's a particular deity that I would say, it also has an Ahrimanian or Ahrimanic aspect. This is a way that we've been sort of accidentally paying homage to. We've accidentally been honoring that deity rather than taking our own place. And so we've been sort of relying on time too much. Can we rediscover who we are by, in a sense, regaining our access to the eternal, which is another way of saying, can we be more deeply present here? That was obviously a lot to draw out of Eliade, but this is kind of why I wanted to get into this, as you can see. I'm going to now continue with the rest of the foreword. I'll repeat that sentence just for the sake of completeness. Eliade said, in a word, man with his various techniques gradually takes the place of time. His labors replace the work of time. To collaborate in the work of nature, to help her to produce at an ever-increasing tempo, to change the modalities of matter. Here, in our view, lies one of the key sources of alchemical ideology. Already we can see that there's a mistake being made, the idea being that to do something faster is always better. This is not the case. That's wrong. That's not true. To do something faster can look like cancerous growth, but we wouldn't want to reduce, like sometimes it is better to speed things up. We do not, of course, claim that there is an unbroken continuity between the mental world of the alchemist and that of the miner, metalworker, and smith. Although indeed the initiation rites and mysteries of the Chinese smiths form an integral part of the traditions later inherited by Chinese Taoism and alchemy. So what he's saying here is that, yeah, he's like drawing the connection between alchemy and metalwork, mining, smithing. He's saying it's not an unbroken connection, historically speaking, because the thing is that Eliade is himself embedded in that myth of time that I was just talking about. He says, but what the smelter, smith, and alchemist have in common is that all three lay claim to a particular magico-religious experience in their relations with matter. This experience is their monopoly, and its secret is transmitted through the initiatory rites of their trades. Okay, so he's talking about the, quote, magico-religious experience. So he's talking about essentially spiritual experience, religious experience, which is underlying and is shared between these different traditions like smelting, smithing, and alchemy. So it's a direct appeal to religious experience, mystical experience, and specifically in terms of its relationship with, yeah, the relationship of these practices with matter or the mother. And we're going to be talking specifically about initiatory rites, so rites of initiation in this context. Quote, all three work on a matter which they hold to be at once alive and sacred. So again, there's a legitimate kind of spiritual work that involves physical behaviors, but is not limited to physicality, because these kind of practitioners don't hold the physical spiritual distinction in the way that modern Western people necessarily do, at least for the last couple hundred years. The point here is that there is a legitimate kind of work on matter, while at the same time that matter is held to be alive and sacred. Quote, and in their labors, they pursue the transformation of matter, its perfection and its transmutation. So there's an aim already toward transformation. There's a legitimate kind of work on matter, while matter is held also to be alive and sacred for the sake of transformation of that matter, for the sake of its perfection and its transmutation. This kind of spiritual orientation lies at the foundation, the backbone of many, many different initiatory rites, but also mythological complexes, again, involving culture, involving belief, involving behavior, involving practices, and so on. Quote, these summary formulations will later be more fully and accurately expounded. But to repeat what has already been stated, this ritualist attitude toward matter involves, in one form or another, man's intervention in the temporal rhythm peculiar to living substances. It's here that we find the point of connection, the point of contact between the alchemist and the artisan metalworker of quote-unquote primitive societies. So the point here is that there is an alchemical tradition, again, in many different parts of the world, that is connected through, it's like a religious complex in a way, grounded in religious experience, that is similar between smelting, smithing, alchemy, and so on, metalwork, that has to do with the legitimate intervention of man in the temporal rhythm that is peculiar, that is natural to living substances. So the questions that come out along the lines of what kinds of interventions are appropriate and why are they appropriate, to what end? And in what ways could they be inappropriate or harmful? And what would that look like? The ideology and techniques of alchemy constitute the main theme of the second part of this work. We've dwelt at some length on Chinese and Indian alchemy, not only because they're less well known, but also because they present in clear form both the experimental and mystical character of its technique. Yeah, so obviously there's a sort of sort of drawing in some of Jung here, like alchemy is not just sort of like primitive chemistry, it's also about the inner and again the experimental and I would say also experiential and mystical character of these techniques and traditions. Quote, it must be emphasized at the outset that alchemy was not in its origins an empirical science, a rudimentary chemistry. This it did not become till later, when for the majority of its practitioners, its mental world had lost its validity and its raison d'etre. Yeah, so alchemy was not a rudimentary science. It had to do with the transformation of the inner and outer world together, co-transformation of self and world. Quote, the history of science recognizes no absolute break between alchemy and chemistry. The one, like the other, works on the same mineral substances, uses the same apparatus, and generally speaking, applies itself to the same experiments. Insofar as one acknowledges the validity of the investigations into the origins of science and technology, the perspective of the historian of chemistry is perfectly defensible. Chemistry was born from alchemy. Or more precisely, it was born from the disintegration of the ideology of alchemy. So again, chemistry was born from the disintegration of the ideology of alchemy. Quote, but if we see it from the standpoint of the history of the human spirit, we see the matter quite differently. Alchemy posed as a sacred science, whereas chemistry came into its own when substances had shed their sacred attributes. Now there must, of necessity, be a break of continuity between the sacred and the profane plane of experience. Okay, so again, he's sort of referring over to his work on the sacred and the profane, which I didn't bring with me, so I won't go into it here, but just to say that there is a deep distinction between sacred and profane that is apparent in this transition from alchemy to chemistry, where when the, again, sacred attributes of substances were shed or lost, so when, let's say, Western culture lost or got rid of, in a sense, the attribution of sacredness to things, to substances, then chemistry could really come into its own. We can now see both sides of that at the same time. We can see how this really gave rise to the scientific method and all the benefits that come from that, but at the same time, the loss of the sacred canopy of the attribution of sacredness, and that through Corbin and others, how that lands us in nihilism so easily. But Eliade in this foreword wants to bring out an example to illustrate the difference between the sacred and profane planes of experience. Quote, one example will suffice to bring out the difference. The origin of the drama, both of Greek tragedy and of the dramatic spectacles of the ancient Near East and of Europe, has been traced back to certain seasonal rituals. So drama originated in certain seasonal rituals, which, broadly speaking, presented the following sequence. Quote, conflict between two antagonistic principles, life and death, God and the dragon, etc. The tragic suffering of the god, lamentation at his death, and jubilation to greet his resurrection. So again, he's now talking about the origins of drama, and we're going to connect this over to the break in continuity between alchemy and chemistry in terms of sacred and profane. And so he was talking about the origins of drama in certain seasonal rituals and talking about 4 stages of this kind of the sequence that typically occurs in those seasonal rituals. The sequence, again, namely being conflict between two antagonistic principles, such as life and death or God and the dragon, then the tragic suffering of the god, the lamentation at his death, and then the jubilation to greet his resurrection, which is essentially the death and rebirth seasonal ritual, roughly speaking. Now he says, Gilbert Murray has even shown that the structure of certain of the tragedies of Euripides retain the pattern of these old ritual spectacles. If such indeed is the true origin of the drama, if in fact it became an autonomous phenomenon as a result of the use of the material of the seasonal rites, one is justified in talking of the sacred origins of the secular theatre. So he's just drawing the connection between religiosity or the sense of sacredness and these seasonal rituals, which justifies us talking about the sacred origins of secular theatre. Okay, what's the relevance? He says, the qualitative difference between the two categories is nonetheless evident. Quote, the ritual spectacle belonged to the sphere of holy things. Again, this is just what we were talking about before. The ritual spectacle belonged to the sphere of holy things. It unleashed religious experiences. It involved the salvation of the entire community. So we're talking about, again, seasonal rituals or rites that turned into drama and spectacle later on. But I would say that when they were more participatory, when they were more involved, when the whole community, the whole tribe could participate in such, again, religious experiences, then that involved a return to the eternal, a return to sacred time, the time beyond time. And that was like literally salvific in the sense of restorative, rejuvenating, and renewing, rites of renewal, as connected obviously with resurrection. So I'm going to say that part again. So he was talking about the difference between sacred and profane in terms of ancient religious rituals, in a phrase. And he said, the qualitative difference between the two categories is nonetheless evident. The ritual spectacle belonged to the sphere of holy things. It unleashed religious experiences. It involved the salvation of the entire community. The secular drama, on the other hand, once it had set the limits of its own spiritual world and defined its system of values, gave rise to experiences of quite a different order. It inspired aesthetic emotions and pursued an ideal of formal perfection quite alien to the values of religious experience. And thus, although the theatre continued in a semi-sacred atmosphere over a period of many centuries, there is a break of continuity between the two dramatic planes. And again, as he says, there is an immeasurable gulf between those who participate in a religious spirit, in the sacred mystery of the liturgy, and those who derive a purely aesthetic pleasure from the beauty of its spectacle and the accompanying music. So the point here is that there's a gulf that opens up, which is the gulf of non-participation. So when we don't participate fully in religious rites of that kind, then we lose access to the effects of religious experience, mystical experience, which can be defined technically now through the mystical experience questionnaire coming out of Johns Hopkins, the MEC 30. The point is that we have lost something and that religious rites of that kind can restore our access to that which we have lost in terms of a vertical relationship with what we could call the transcendent or the sacred. But the important thing, because I'm sort of, for example, I did a video on Nietzsche and the sort of Apollonian, the Dionysian, which is like everyone ought to kind of know about that without needing to rely on me to draw that out. But there's a problem of just aestheticizing. Aestheticizing is that we're looking at something over there and seeing its aesthetic qualities and not necessarily participating in that thing. This is in some way Nietzsche's mistake, or a mistake that Nietzsche was still stuck with. The point is, we've lost something and that we can get it back if we're wise in how we regain it, how we recover it. But there would be the opposite point, which is that there's something that we gained. That this, the change toward the secular theatre, for example, came with certain advantages or affordances that we wouldn't want to lose sight of. Okay, I'm going to keep going and just finish this off. He's saying, I'm going to try and rip through the remaining couple of pages because we've already talked about quite enough. So Eliade continues. Of course, alchemical operations were not symbolic. They were physical operations carried out in laboratories. Yet their purpose was not that of the practical chemist. The latter, the chemist, carries out his exact observations of physico-chemical phenomena and performs systematic experiments in order to penetrate to the structure of matter. So this is kind of like the MO of the chemist. He says the alchemist, on the other hand, is concerned with the passion, the death, and the marriage of substances, insofar as they will tend to transmute matter and human life. So there's a quite different intention behind alchemy that is kind of, in some ways, Eliade thinks, analogous to the difference between religious theatre and secular theatre that we were just discussing. That's grounded in access to religious experience or not, and participation in seasonal ritual or not, or lack thereof. And so in a similar way, like the intention of the chemist is experimental in the way that was just described, whereas the alchemist has a far more orientation toward, or at least inclusive of transformation, not only of substances, but also of, in a sense, matter itself and human life. The goals of the alchemist were the philosopher's stone and the elixir vitae, the elixir of life. Jung has shown that the symbolism of alchemical processes is reenacted in the dreams and talk of patients completely ignorant of alchemy. Jung's observations are of interest not only to depth psychology, they also indirectly confirm the soteriological function, which is one of the main constituents of alchemy. Okay, so there's basically the ideas here are that the traditions and mythology of alchemy, especially as connected with, like as shows up naturally in the unconscious, let's say, relevant to the sort of natural human inclination toward religion and religious experience grounded in transformation, in a word. Like that we have this orientation to deeply transform, to access, you could say, the source of religion, and that is in some ways access to that place, if you like, is a vessel for transformation. That's how we transform. The alchemy expresses that and guides us toward that mythologically. It would be unwise to try to estimate the original qualities of alchemy from the manner of its impact on the beginnings and triumph of chemistry. From the alchemist's point of view, chemistry represented a fall because it meant the secularization of a sacred science. But this is not to make an apologia for alchemy, but to obey the elementary requirements of a history of culture. There is indeed only one way of understanding a cultural phenomenon which is alien to one's own ideological pattern, and that is to place oneself at its very center, and from there to track down all the values that radiate from it. Only by looking at things from the standpoint of the alchemist will we succeed in gaining an insight into his mental world and thereby appraise the extent of its originality. So the point is, we're not just taking the perspective of the chemist, which is to say that, oh, alchemy was like a primitive science, and then we got chemistry, and it's like way better. It's like, no, that's very silly. The point is that from different perspectives, from different points of view, we can, learn to appreciate the significance of these traditions differently. And so the point is that by taking perspectives that are more mythological, more historical, more depth psychological, that this reveals something about the historical and cultural significance of alchemical traditions that has been hidden from us, that has been obscured, that we've been blind to. And that only by learning to practice taking up the perspective of the alchemists, can we get insight into their mental world and thereby appraise the extent of its originality. That's kind of his leading off point. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to invoke, well, I'm trying to invoke perspectival and participatory knowing, to use a sort of Vervaekean anachronism, and apply that to alchemy. Let's see how I do. The same, and this is taken directly into ethnographic studies. I think I talked about etic or emic, and I might even bring that up right now, etic versus emic. The difference being, so there's placing oneself, emic, it's like the insider's view, whereas etic is the outsider's view. So an emic style in ethnography and anthropology involves taking yourself right into the middle and trying to get a subjective viewpoint of what's going on. This is a good idea. And there was this whole battle in anthropology about whether that was the case. So similar. So what I'm saying is that tradition, emic, taking the insider's view, is in some ways orienting toward taking up the perspective of, for example, the alchemists. Whereas the scientists, the pure scientists, would say this in some ways compromises your objectivity. And to an extent, that's true, but I won't get into that whole debate here. We'll just keep going. The point being that it's beneficial to be able to take both perspectives, and that can be practiced through specific skills and techniques. Quote, the same methodological requirement would apply to any primitive or exotic cultural phenomenon. Whatever, before we proceed to judge it, we must fully understand it and become imbued, as it were, with its ideology, whatever form it may take, myth, symbol, rite, or social attitude. Anyway, he's just going on about why it's valuable to take up alchemy or to try and understand alchemy from different angles. It goes on, last couple of pages, he says, some strange sort of inferiority complex seems to inhibit us, the representatives of European culture, from talking about primitive cultures in just and unprejudiced terms. Indeed, we have a big inferiority complex, and so we're genocidal and so on. If we attempt to describe the logical coherence of an archaic culture and discuss its nobility or humanity without stressing the less favorable aspects of its sociological, economic, or hygienic practices, we run the risk of being suspected of evasion or even obscurantism. So it's like, okay, yes, don't be too much of a Pollyanna, but don't be too imperialistic. Can we get balanced points of view? Let's try. For close on 2 centuries, the European scientific spirit has made prodigious efforts to explain the world so as to conquer and transform it. Yeah, ideologically, this triumph of science has manifested itself in a faith in unlimited progress and the idea that the more modern we become, the more likely we are to approach absolute truth and the full plenitude of human dignity. Right, so this is obviously what we now understand to be completely bankrupt. It's not good to have this attitude of trying to explain everything, trying to conquer the world, or intending to transform it because it's broken in some way, because then we get into the metacrisis, right? All the problems that go along with modernism, as in the postmodern critique. We're not necessarily more likely to approach absolute truth or the full plenitude of human dignity, to put it that way, if we, quote unquote, make more progress. And from my point of view, people like the stuff I was talking about regarding Corbin and Heidegger completely blow up the idea of human progress. We get stuff like the myth of eternal return, for example, which is a cyclical model. We can obviously insert spiral dynamics through all the people who talk about spiral dynamics as a way of getting both, but I'll leave that behind and keep going. What he's saying to finish this off is that, however, for some time now, and this is kind of like news to them in the middle half of the 20th century, right? However, for some time now, the investigations of ethnologists and Orientalists have revealed the existence of highly estimable societies in the past, and in the present too, for that matter, which, although quite devoid of scientific prowess in the modern sense, or any aptitude for industrial achievement, have nevertheless worked out their own systems of metaphysics, morality, and even economics. And these systems have been shown to be perfectly valid in their own right. Again, news to us at that particular time in history. We haven't yet at that time gotten to the idea that we might actually be missing something that could be kind of important. Anyway, going on. But our own culture has become so excessively jealous of its values that it tends to regard with suspicion any attempt to boost the achievement of other primitive or exotic cultures. Gosh, having for so long and so heroically followed the path which we believed to be the best and only one worthy of the intelligent, self-respecting individual, and having in the process sacrificed the best part of our soul in order to satisfy the colossal intellectual demands of scientific and industrial progress, we have grown suspicious of the greatness of primitive cultures. Yeah, blah, blah. He goes on. The stalwarts of European culture have now reached the point where they wonder whether their own work has been worth all the effort and sacrifice expended upon it, since it may no longer be regarded as the peak of man's spiritual achievement or the only culture possible to the 20th century, especially in light of the First and Second World Wars, I might add. one paragraph to finish, and he says, this sense of inferiority, however, is being rapidly rendered out of date by the course of history itself. Non-European civilizations are now being studied, finally, and investigated in their own right. And it being studied, yeah, like zoo animals. I mean, this is like, do we have to study them? Like, come on. What if we got to know them as people? You know, would that be so difficult? Apparently so. Anyway, non-European civilizations are now being studied and investigated in their own right. Gosh. And likewise, it is to be hoped that those periods in the history of the European spirit, which are closer to traditional cultures and clearly marked off from everything that was achieved in the West after the triumph of the scientific method, will no longer be judged in that polemically partisan spirit characteristic of the 18th and 19th centuries. Alchemy is one of those creations of the pre-scientific era, and the historiographer who would attempt to present it as a rudimentary phase of chemistry, or indeed as a secular science, would be treading on very shaky ground. The historian's perspective has been vitiated by his eagerness to demonstrate the beginnings of experiment and observation found in certain alchemical works, and consequently he has assigned an exaggerated importance to those texts which revealed the first rough gropings toward the scientific method, while ignoring others, in which the alchemical perspective proper was patently more valuable. In other words, these interpretations of alchemical writings paid less attention to the theoretical world of which they were part of, than to those values which properly belong to the historian of chemistry of the 19th and 20th centuries. The values, that is, of experimental science. Yeah, so he's just saying that basically there's something that we can learn that's new about trying to take up the perspective of alchemists, and that's the MO, roughly speaking. The raison d'etre. I forget other French phrases of this text. And that's what we're going to be going into, again, in some detail. I'm now going to skip the preface to the Phoenix edition and move into The Forge in the Crucible. Chapter 1, Meteorites and Metallurgy.